conversation with you all. Similar to other events that we've done, we want this very interactive. So Q&A, we have the stand mic here for you guys to ask questions, and kind of podcast style where we'll learn from the brothers, mashallah, and hopefully it will be of benefit. The last thing to mention, of course, we have Isha at 8:15, so we'll wrap up then. We do have some refreshments, chai and some kebabs and stuff. So maybe people, as you need a break, you can step out, grab some refreshments, come back in. Food is not in the musalla, but you're welcome to have it in the hallway. Shalom.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Thank you, Brother Atif, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. Inshallah, today we'll discuss estate planning, which is one of those topics that we often avoid thinking about. Maybe it feels so far in the future, or maybe it's just a little overwhelming. But here's the thing. Planning isn't just about protecting your assets or protecting your wealth. It's about protecting your family, your values, and the legacy you leave behind. In my years of working in the finance industry, I've seen what happens when people don't plan ahead. Families, arguments, assets lost, or just pure stress. But I've also seen the peace of mind that comes when everything is in order. And today, inshallah, I'm honored to be moderating tonight's session with Brother Ahmed Sheikh, who is a highly experienced estate planner and attorney. And together, inshallah, we'll walk you through the essentials, what estate planning is, why it matters, and how to make it work for you and your family. But before we begin, let me just do a little bit of introduction about Brother Ahmed Sheikh. Ahmed Sheikh is a board-certified specialist in estate planning and a former chair of the Orange County Bar Association section on trust and estates. Since 2006, he has helped hundreds of clients with estate planning, asset protection, and charitable planning. Ahmed also writes and speaks extensively about estate planning. His work includes Estate Planning for the Muslim Client, which is a book he's authored. We're so fortunate to have you here with us today, Brother Ahmed, and I want to get started with just the basics. Tell us a little bit about what estate planning is and why everyone, even those who think they don't have much, should care about it.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. It's a pleasure being here, being invited to this beautiful masjid. I'm in Orange County, but I was born in San Diego. It's the first time coming here, and it's a wonderful privilege and honor to come. Okay, so as far as estate planning and what that is, and why people actually normally will think about it, there comes a time in a person's life when they come to the realization that they're not going to be here forever. They can't take their stuff with them when they go. And there are people that they love and they care about, and they want to make sure and do right by them, right? So they realize they have a responsibility, and that responsibility extends beyond themselves. And one of the things that we do also recognize is, well, when we look around and we see what the world is actually like. One way of thinking about this is that there's this one story. And there's a story that you're probably very familiar with. You've heard this story before. And it involves a man and a woman. And they're married. And they have this daughter, this lovely young daughter. And then something really tragic happened, this being a story about estate planning. The mom, the wife of this man, passes away. Does anybody have a guess as to what this man does within, say, a year to 18 months of his wife passing away? Anybody hazard a guess? Yes, brother in the back. He remarries. That's exactly right. That's what happens. Has anybody heard of this before? Has anybody heard of a married couple where the woman passed away and then the husband got remarried? Anybody ever heard of this before? Okay, a couple of people. How many of you, just by a show of hands, will not raise your hand no matter what I do or say today? Right. Okay, so what happens is that this person gets remarried, and we have this adage in estate planning that women mourn, men replace. right? And so this guy, he ends up getting remarried, and he marries this woman that has 2 daughters about the same age as his daughter. And they're fine, everything is going well, but then tragically this man passes away. And then this young girl, this orphan, she then lives as a servant in her own home, and her own wealth and the wealth of her family is weaponized against her, right? And that story that you probably are thinking of right now is the story of Cinderella. And the story of Cinderella is actually something that doesn't originate with Disney and doesn't originate with the Grimm brothers. Literary scholars have looked at the story of Cinderella and found that there is a version of the Cinderella story that exists in all cultures and all languages throughout recorded time, throughout all of human history. If there is a written record, if there are stories being told, and there is a story being told about an orphan whose wealth has been unjustly consumed, and that wealth has been taken away from that person, and that oppression is taking place against the orphan. And that story is something that we all know about. And in fact, the Quran actually addresses this issue, right? It's Quran, Surah Nisa, verse that's the 10th verse of Surah Nisa. Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Innal ladhina ya'kuluna amwal al-yatama zulman innama ya'kuluna fi butunihim nara wa sayasluna sa'ira. Indeed, those who unjustly consume orphans' wealth, in fact, consume nothing but fire in their bellies, and they will burn in a blaze. The next ayah, that's the 11th ayah, starts with what? Yusikumullahu fi awladikum. And that is the beginning of what is known in the Quran as the Mawarith ayah, that expresses the various shares of inheritance. And the shares of inheritance that exist in Islam are mandatory. They are fard on Muslims, because you are supposed to, it is your responsibility as a Muslim, as a human, as a person who is responsible for others, to make sure that when you pass away, that inheritance is distributed not based on your own whims or your own vanity or how you think is right or wrong. No, that's irrelevant. In fact, inheritance is way too important for you to feel like, oh, I'm just going to give it, everything's going to be fine. I love this woman, she's going to take care of everything, or it's going to be this family and everything is going to be fine. No, inheritance is a right that belongs to these individuals. And so then it becomes your responsibility to make sure that inheritance is distributed appropriately, and that you are not doing an injustice to anybody. If you are in fact doing that, you are essentially stealing from the people that you love. You are stealing from the people, or you are causing a theft, I should say, from the very people, from these future orphans that are your own children, right? And that's exactly what's happening. And so if you look at Cinderella from a different view, who is the villain in Cinderella? Is it the wicked stepmother? Well, maybe, but I mean, the villain isn't the wicked stepmother any more than a shark is the villain when somebody is throwing somebody in shark-infested waters, right? The villain here might as well be the birth mother and the birth father who didn't think to do enough to make sure that their daughter was adequately cared for. And so when we are thinking about inheritance, we're talking about estate planning, we're talking about a world where you do not exist. And the circumstances, the people you leave behind, you have no idea. You don't know who's going to be married to who. You don't know who's rich, who's poor, who's sick, who has a gambling problem, who has a drug problem. You don't know any of these things. And so, given that you're dealing with an uncertain future, you want to make sure that you are doing the best that you can to look after the people that you love and that you care about before the time comes and you can't do anything about it anymore. And so there's a hadith that it's unbecoming of a believer to let 2 nights pass without making a will about, and it has anybody who has something worth passing on to make a will about it. And so it is vital to make sure that you have accounted for what you own, and you accounted for those you are responsible for. And there's of course other things like guardianship, healthcare decisions, estate planning is a very, very large topic. It involves tax planning, asset protection planning, charitable planning. There's lots and lots of things that we can do for people. But for the vast majority of the people, it's just this. It's just, I'm an adult. I'm responsible. And this is me being responsible.
Thank you, Brother Ahmed. So now that we know what estate planning is and why it's important, can you let us know what happens without a plan? I'm sure some of us heard the word probate before, probate court, right? We've heard about that. So that's one of the consequences of not having estate planning in place. So can you just touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So probate is basically just a court. I mean, in other places, in other jurisdictions, it might be called orphans court. Here in California, it's referred to a probate court, and that's just judicial supervision of how assets are distributed. And if you don't have a will, no problem. The government will give you a will. It's not going to be Islamic. It's not going to be distributed based on the Islamic rules of inheritance. But there's going to be some cost associated with it. Some people think of the cost and the process as being kind of hefty. Of course, if distribution is being done wrong, if you're Muslim, then of course it's just being done wrong. That's not as big of an issue as how it is that your property tends to be arranged. If you own property, typically what happens is that you own property joint tenancy with right of survivorship, if you are married, right? So if you're married, typically what happens is everything goes to the surviving spouse. If everything goes to the surviving spouse, and the surviving spouse is, say, the husband, right? And what did we establish? What's the husband typically going to be doing after his wife dies? Anybody remember that? There's one brother here who knows what happens. He knows what's going on. Okay, so that's basically what will happen, right? So the next person will end up getting it, and so the whole situation with respect to Cinderella plays out. And that whole issue of what we might refer to as accidental disinheritance, which is to say that the surviving spouse gets everything, then that spouse passes away and then gets remarried to somebody else, and on it goes, and it could be kind of a chain, and whoever owned it before, whoever was entitled to it before might not get anything. So one of the consequences necessarily of the way people own property is not that there's going to be some horrible court process that is going to take a long time, is going to be expensive. That's almost, if that happens, that's almost good compared to what might happen if there isn't a probate, which is to say, just by operation of the way things are owned in the account or in the deed, it just goes to this other person and not to the orphans and not to the other people. In Islam, inheritance actually goes in a number of different directions, not just the surviving spouse. So if, for example, you have a wife, you have a father, you have a mother, you have children, all of these people, assuming that they are Muslim, are all entitled to inheritance, right? In the United States, typically, that is not how we do things. In the United States, inheritance typically goes downstream. Typically, the surviving spouse gets everything. That's usually the way it works. And the entire legal system tends to be rigged to give everything to the surviving spouse. We just assume that that's what's going to happen, and that is often the worst result that could happen. You do want to make sure that children, that their rights are vindicated. Parents, their rights are vindicated. And if you do not do things consistent with the Islamic rules, then those rights might simply be abandoned.
Jazakallahukhairan. So you did mention wills, right?
Yes.
And you did mention trust. Now, can you talk about the difference between a will and a trust? And also, for the Muslim family, what kind of considerations they need to know when setting up like a will or a trust? And just start with the difference.
Yeah, so a will, a trust, a power of attorney, real estate transfers, certificates of trust, these are all pieces of paper with stuff written on it. Now, they actually have specific purposes as to why it is that we do them, but what's important isn't that you have pieces of paper with stuff written on it. What's important is that you're taking care of your family and you're doing right by them, and that all of these things is, well, what's the plan? What's the overall plan? What's supposed to happen? Now, a will and a trust, a trust, every time we do a trust, we normally have a will associated with it. So no, they're not one or another. They're usually going to be both. And the reason for that is a trust is a document that is a way to hold property to avoid probate. Most of the time, a trust could have other purposes as well. A trust follows contract principles. Why we like it for the purposes of the Islamic rules of inheritance is that a trust is not subject to judicial supervision. And the rules in probate, so we have this whole section of law called the probate code, and the probate code addresses succession of assets after somebody's death, and a judge oversees it in something called a probate court. And of course, probate court is very busy. There's stuff happening there every single day, and so what'll happen is that when there's a probate, then a judge will oversee it. There are various people that are involved in the process. There's something called a probate referee, an executor, and then of course there's usually going to be an attorney. Lots of various people take various types of fees. Rule of thumb is that it's about 5% of the gross value of the estate. It could be more or less, but usually that's normally the cost, and that's the gross value of the estate. So if you have like $1 million house and a $900,000 mortgage, then the cost is like $50,000, right? So it's so normally like a will could be very, very expensive to administer. In the United States, not just the United States actually, specifically California, probate tends to be kind of expensive. So we tend to plan based on a trust, and then the will is it serves two functions. One is as a backstop. So if you don't have assets inside your trust, a trust is only as good as the property that's inside the trust. So a trust is a contract between three different kinds of people. The first is the grantor. The grantor is the person who creates the trust in the first place. So I have a house, I have a bank account, I'm putting this in my own trust, right? And that means I'm the grantor. Now, I'm giving this to a trustee to manage this trust. Who's the trustee? Well, I'm the trustee. I'll be my own trustee, right? I don't need to pay anybody to be a trustee. I'll be my own trustee, right? And it's for the benefit of the beneficiary. That's the third person, and the whole reason this trust exists in the first place. And who's the beneficiary? Well, it's my money. I might as well benefit from it. So I'm the beneficiary, right? Well, then you might think, well, aren't your kids the beneficiary? No, of course not. The kids are not the beneficiary. It's my money. It's not my kids' money, right? Okay, well, when I die, well, that's different. Beneficiaries are different. The trustee is different. I can't take it with me. So I can't manage it. I can't write checks. So I'm going to say, after I die, I'm going to name this person to be the trustee. Well, what if that person is also dead? Well, I'm going to name somebody else and then somebody else. So I'm going to name a few different people who are going to be the successor trustees. And then I'm going to name successor beneficiaries. And those beneficiaries are going to be those same people who are entitled to inheritance under the Islamic rules of inheritance, right? And who are those people going to be? We talked about that before. Well, if I'm lucky enough to have parents, then it'll be my parents. If I have children, they'll be my children. If I have a wife, it'll go to my wife. Right? So these are the people who are going to be entitled to inheritance under certain circumstances. It might be the siblings, it might be uncles and aunts. It could go wide or it could go narrow, but the various people who are always entitled, assuming that they are Muslim, the people who are like sort of the first degree is spouse, parents, children. Those people pretty much always get it. And then other people get inheritance depending on the existence or non-existence of other people. And so grandparents, like a paternal grandfather, might get it if the father is not available, right? So those people might get inheritance or might not. And so what happens with a trust that might not happen with a will is, well, what happens if you do a living trust and say I have a father and a mother and I have kids and I have a wife, and then I do my living trust, and then my father dies, and then I die like 5 days later. I didn't get a chance to redo my trust, right? And to change the shares of inheritance. What happens then? Does anybody know if California judges are competent to interpret Sharia? Anybody come across this issue before? Anybody know if they are? Anybody have a guess? No, they're not. They're not trained in that. They're not going to interpret it. That's not their business. That's not what they do, right? So you cannot assume that a judge is going to be like, oh yeah, I see what happened here, and so we need to recalculate the shares of inheritance, and I'm looking at, they're not going to do it, right? And so what you need to be able to do is have a process to make sure that the shares of inheritance are correct, even if life throws you a few curveballs, right? And so when that happens, you need to make sure that the trust is drafted in such a way that inheritance is going to be done properly, even if it's not done exactly properly because you didn't know that your father was going to die 5 days before you. You had no idea that that's how life was going to go, right? And so you are able to do that in a trust, which has potentially that flexibility, but a will does not. Now, another thing is that a trust deals with property. A will can deal with more things. A power of attorney can also deal with more things. One of the things that a will is necessary for is if you have minor children. If you have minor children, you need to be able to name guardians for your minor children. Who's going to take care of my child if I am not able to raise my child myself, right? Who are these people going to be? And it's really important, if you are a parent, to think about that issue, because it comes up a lot more than you might imagine. And so you name the guardian for a minor child in the will, not in the trust, because a trust deals with property and your children are not property. And so that's one of, I guess, several distinctions. We also do a power of attorney, which deals with incapacity, and we might deal with other documents as well, depending on the individual circumstances.
Absolutely. Jazakallah khair. So now we know with modern medicine, alhamdulillah, people are living longer than back in the days. And surprisingly, nobody just dies suddenly now. You'll be sick for a little bit, right? For a long time maybe. So these are tough conversations to have now to make things easier in the future. So you touched on this a little bit, but I want you to go in depth a little bit about incapacity planning. So what happens if someone is unable to make their own decisions, right? Or decide for themselves? What can be done? How they can prepare for that?
Wait a minute, nobody dies suddenly? I didn't hear about this. Oh, no, it happens. Okay, so there's a lot of people out there. Like when we think about incapacity, there's a few things. One is, okay, well, you're in a coma, in a bed. That's a relatively easy case, right? The really hard cases is that there are people out there that are walking, talking, telling jokes. They might be wise, right? You go to them for a problem. You go to them with a marital problem, and they'll fix your marital problems. They'll fix your business problems. They'll do just amazing work, and they're just smart. But if they got like a message from WhatsApp asking for their bank account number, they might give it to them. And they might not have done that a year before, right? And so there's the ability to be smart and capable in many ways. And then there's also the loss of what we refer to as executive decision-making ability, right? Somebody just bumps their frontal lobe or something just happens, and they're just not able to make good financial decisions, and they can be scammed very easily, right? And I've seen this quite a bit. I mean, like this person who was just very, very organized and really smart, been fit. I mean, he was an elderly guy, but he went to the gym, and suddenly he meets this one woman at a restaurant, and he's investing like hundreds of thousands of dollars in rice paddies in Vietnam, and he doesn't know what's going on. So there's a lot of that type of thing that, and the family, of course, is just everybody's pulling their hair. Like, what are you supposed to do under circumstances like that? And so this is actually something where we do something that's protective of your wealth, and more importantly, protective of your privacy and your dignity, right? Because if you have a father, right? If you have a father that is making really bad financial decisions suddenly, is hanging out with the wrong people, exploitative criminal-like people, suddenly this is happening, well, what do you do? I mean, that's a very difficult situation. You could go to court and get a conservatorship, You can go and get a conservatorship against your father, right? How do you think that's going to go, right? What's that going to do to the relationship with your father, right? Now, I know all kinds of families, right? I know people, the adult kids, them calling their father crazy, that's just Tuesday. That's just what they do. Other people, before they say something about their father's capacity, they would be fearful of their tongue falling off, right? It would be something that they would be very, very afraid of doing. And yet, it's a very necessary part of life, where if that were to happen, one of the ways that we do it in the trust, there are these rules and they're contract principles. And so the contract will deal with incapacity. And so how do we determine incapacity in a private way? And so one of the things that I prefer doing is, I would say, get a shura. You get a group of people, not your son, not when it's too late, not your wife or husband or whatever. You do that when you do the planning. If there's a question about my capacity, if there's a question about my ability to make good business decisions, good spending decisions, right? Because normally, okay, you're a man, you don't want anybody's permission to go and buy shoes. You don't want anybody's permission to go and invest some money, right? That's not you. You're normally not going to be like, you don't want to do that most of the time. People don't operate that way, right? And of course, family members are usually not going to question it, but at some point they will, or they might, right? Now, if they question it, if one person goes and says, you're making really horrible decisions and you're being scammed by this guy, well, that person might be offended, right? If it's one person. But if you have a group of people, a shura that you appointed, purpose-built for this particular decision, and that group, without going to court, without making a public spectacle of it, without making it public at all, right? That the shura decides you should not make financial decisions anymore. The role of the trustee should pass to this other person that you previously chose, right? You chose this person, you chose this shura to decide your incapacity. This takes it out of it being a public spectacle. This preserves your dignity and your privacy, and it preserves your wealth, and it preserves, to the best of our ability, family harmony and cohesion, right? And so those are the things that we want to do when something very difficult like that comes around.
Absolutely. Thank you. So let's talk about beneficiaries now. If someone passes away and leaves young children, right? How can they ensure that they leave these kids financially taken care of and otherwise as well?
So there are a few things. One is, of course, we talked a little bit about guardians and needing guardians for minor children. There's another issue of course, who the beneficiary is, and we know who the beneficiary is based on the Sharia actually determines, and all the schools of thought for the vast majority of people, it's the shares of inheritance are pretty much going to be the same. Especially if you're planning and you're talking about a situation where their parents, kids, non sort of edge cases, it's usually going to be the same. There's going to be some issues with somebody who has a primarily non-Muslim family or something like that. Then there's going to be some issues as to what the beneficiary would be, or those types of situations. But as far as beneficiaries, there's two areas. Well, one, they get inheritance, and it's their right. Somebody did some study years ago. I remember this, where I think it was some car company that did this study, and they found out that adult kids will typically, the majority of them will visit a luxury car dealership within 72 hours of their parents passing away. Right, yeah. So normally that doesn't mean they're going to buy it. They just look at a car, right? I don't know if that's true or not, but it sort of rings true. But anyway. What normally happens is that sometimes people will make decisions with their inheritance, and they might not be the most responsible decisions. And so a lot of parents get concerned about their kids, that their kids they're not going to say, they don't save money, they buy too many expensive things, they're not thinking about the future, they're 20 and they're not thinking about retirement, they're not even thinking about much of anything except getting fancy things and showing off to their friends or whatever the case may be, right? And so you're going to be like, yeah, but he's going to get like $700,000 when I die, and what's he going to do? It's all going to be gone, and what happens? Well, in Islam, they have the right to inheritance, right? And the right to inheritance includes, well, it's their money, and if they want to buy a Ferrari with that money, there really isn't anything in Islam that prevents them necessarily from doing that. There are, of course, haram things they can't do. One of the things that we often will do for people is keep it in a trust. So sometimes, instead of giving inheritance outright to an individual, we give it to people in trust. And this could have multiple purposes, right? Because sometimes inheritance isn't just cash. It might be a business interest, right? And a business interest that might be a going concern. It might be a family business. It might, it might be farmland. There might be various things that people own that they need to pass on in a particular way. And so what we might do is, an inheritance isn't necessarily just a right to cash. It might be an ownership interest or some type of interest in something, right? And that has to be defined. And so if we leave it in trust, then we have a trustee, a continuing trustee. And if that person, if the beneficiary wants money and it's available, like it's liquid, the trustee should have to actually give it over to that person, right? Sometimes if it's a capital asset, like say I want to buy an office building, you just buy it within the trust. That way, if the beneficiary is sued or goes bankrupt or gets divorced, makes bad life choices, whatever the case may be, the assets are protected. So you have a system where you're protecting the right to inheritance while at the same time giving some space, because this has actually been studied. If you leave assets in a trust, especially if it's a protective trust, children will understand, I should say adult children will typically understand that money is a lot more, or those assets, that legacy from their parents, is a lot more valuable in some ways than money that they earn themselves. And they might be a lot more careful about how it is that they manage it. So sometimes people do put a lot of thought into these things because they know their children. Some children are quite responsible. Some children, they're just worried about them overspending and then of course, there's also the other issue, which is depending on the nature of wealth that exists, wealth from within families can be a source or an instrument of oppression, right? Oppression within the family. This particularly happens with families that have substantial wealth. And so managing wealth in a trust so that you want to maintain, and there's other, it's not just making sure that inheritance is distributed, you want to make sure that cohesion, multi-generational cohesion within the family remains, that the wealth does not become something that divides, but instead unites families. And so there's a lot of different ways, and the Islamic rules of inheritance is the rules of inheritance. It is not exactly the same thing as estate planning. Estate planning is organizing your assets, organizing your ownership, organizing how things are going to be taxed and how much taxes are going to be affected in this whole deal. There's just a lot of, and of course it includes charitable planning. Sometimes we have families that have mission statements that how they're going to function. How they're going to function going on across the generations. And so there's a lot of potential things that could go into how are the beneficiaries going to be treated. That's a huge subject by itself.
And you did talk about inheritance, right? And subhanAllah, in Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he talks about salah, for example, or zakah, he says, aqimu salah wa atu zakah, not specific. But when it comes to inheritance, subhanAllah, we have Surah An-Nisa, which details the guidelines of the inheritance and who should get what and how much and all that. So how does the inheritance law in the Quran influence the estate planning process in general?
So inheritance is often central, not often, it's central to it, right? There's a few different areas. One is, what do I own? right? And that's a real question for not just very wealthy families, but lots of families. Like, what do I own? Because a lot of times, married couples own everything together. And we talked about this as joint tenancy with right of survivorship. Sometimes, even if it's not joint tenancy with right of survivorship, just for convenience, it might be in the name of one spouse or another, but the spouses assume it's both of theirs. That needs to be clarified. Often what we do is we have a property agreement clarifying that as between a husband and a wife. Because, does anybody know the answer to this? Like in Islam, does your mother-in-law get to inherit from you? Anybody know that? 2 people know the answer to that question. No, your mother-in-law does not inherit from you. Your mother-in-law will inherit from your wife, right? Everyone's clear on that, yeah? Okay, good. So you want to make sure that the people who have rights on you, because how can you vindicate rights to inheritance if it is not clear to you what it is that you own when you die, right? If everything goes to the surviving spouse, or everything goes, well, where does it happen, right? I once had this one situation where this woman who had, she ended up, they had like quite a bit of land, like farm, all that stuff, and it was like, she ended up getting everything. It was joint tenancy with right of survivorship. She got everything. And she was like, wait a minute, this doesn't sound right. I have kids, and my husband had another wife who also had kids, and it's not right for any of these people to not get anything, right? And so she actually fixed it. She actually went through the trouble of just making sure that the other wife and all the other kids she also made sure that everything was organized properly and that she distributed everything appropriately. Most people are not going to do that, right? Most people have bills and they just feel like, sometimes there's a sense of entitlement that happens, or sometimes people just get into debt or they're under financial circumstances that do not allow them to make sure that inheritance is distributed properly. So it is vital to make sure that the ownership is done and then everything is distributed properly. I'm sorry, there was another aspect to your question that I needed to answer? Okay.
So part of the estate planning includes obviously planning for your assets. That includes your house, right? The money in the bank, your retirement accounts, right? And part of estate planning is also charitable giving. So I want to diverge a little bit to talk about charitable giving, right? But how can investing through a halal lens benefit both the family and their charitable intentions? Because most people, inshallah, would want to leave behind like a sadaqah jariyah or something like that in that particular sense.
Yeah. Okay, so just one of the things that we were talking about in our call before is that this has to do with the whole issue of is our rizq halal, right? And that's just a concern that a lot of us will have. Necessarily, we just want to make sure that the food we eat is halal, and everything that we do, we want to make sure and do the best that we can. Inheritance, estate planning has to do with making sure that your parting shot in this world is not one of injustice to the people that you care about the most. And we do have Muslims who have different kinds of businesses, who invest in all kinds of stuff that's sketchy, that they shouldn't necessarily be investing in, or businesses that they shouldn't necessarily have. As far as my own planning, I don't necessarily care about that. I hope that this is, for most people, this is trying to live a halal life is a journey, right? It's like we start in one place and hopefully we'll end up in another. And I think that something like Amana mutual funds is part of that journey for a lot of people, where they will figure, okay, well, I want to, if I'm going to invest in mutual funds, there's this mutual fund or that mutual fund, and you have to, like, of course, investigate and decide, well, okay, I'm comfortable with this or not comfortable with that, and then you, of course, invest for growth. Now, a lot of growth or income or retirement planning, education planning, those types of things. Of course, inheritance, whatever it is, whatever it grows to, at the time you leave this world, it is what it is. Then it gets divided up. You have the ability in Islam to give up to 1/3 of your estate, not an obligation. But in the Quran, the wasiyah and the debt comes out before inheritance. And what we know is that you have a maximum of 1/3 of your estate that can go towards the wasiyah. Now, when we talk about wasiyah, there's sometimes some confusion because sometimes people think of a wasiyah as being a will, and at least in our parlance in the United States, it's not a will, and at least the way we think about it. It is your discretionary ability. A wasiyah cannot go to people who are already entitled to inheritance in Islam. So, your kids, parents, children, they don't get wasiyah unless they are non-Muslim. If they're not Muslim, then you can give them wasiyah. The most common use of a wasiyah is charitable giving. So a very common use of a wasiyah is that, well, I go to this beautiful masjid and I want it to, it might be one of the bigger donations that you give. It's easier to kind of give a big donation after you've passed away. And so you can do that. There are, of course, other mechanisms that exist as well. One of them, and the most common one, is called a charitable remainder trust. So a charitable remainder trust is often used it could be used for business succession planning, retirement planning, a variety of things. So say, for example, a person invests in in Bitcoin or Nvidia or something that just went up into the moon, right? And then what they will do is, I'm going to pay like a big capital gains tax. Well, in order to avoid or at least delay the capital gains tax, there's a variety of ways to kind of delay the capital gains tax. If you are charitably inclined, one of the things that you can do is say, I'm going to put this in a charitable remainder trust. I'm going to sell everything, and the sale is going to be free of any capital gains taxes. And while it's within the trust, I can buy and sell to my heart's content without actually incurring any income taxes, any capital gains taxes, any of that stuff. Now, there's going to be a formula where it's going to be distributed to me, a percentage of it or a set amount. So it could be it's called a unit trust or an annuity trust. And you give yourself an amount, and then after you pass away or after a period of years, everything within that trust goes to charity. Now, one of the things that we can often show and illustrate to people is that, say, you were to sell the asset and then put it in a mutual fund versus not selling the asset, putting in a charitable remainder of trust, and investing it in exactly the same stuff. Say, hypothetically, it's amount of mutual funds, right? So you have a big capital asset, like like Bitcoin or something, right? And you want to sell it, you want to unload it, and you say, I'm going to sell it, and I'm going to then pay myself. There's some taxes when you pay yourself, like on the what's called the unit trust amount. But while it's growing, it grows tax-free. And then, of course, when it's ultimately distributed to charity, that is also tax-free. But there's some taxes paid when it's being distributed to you. One of the things that we can show people, and this is like not a discussion per se of a charitable remainder trust, and this is only one of several different types of charitable vehicles that are out there. But we can show that if you invest in exactly the same thing, you will be richer. Your family will actually be better off with a charitable remainder trust than it would be by paying off the taxes and investing it in the exact same thing, which might be amount of mutual funds. So you can actually save quite a bit in taxes, grow your wealth, and give a lot more in charity than you might have thought possible by doing a vehicle like that. So that's one possibility. It's a very common one, the charitable remainder trust. It's something that's part of the tax code. But there are several others and other ways to, like, if you're an investor and you want to look into retirement and you want to do some charitable planning, that's a really solid choice.
Thank you, Brother Ahmed. So, if I want to get started, what's the simplest way to get started, right? Do I just go online and find a tool and just, Google wills and find someone? Or what do I need to get prepared if I'm meeting with an attorney? What steps should I take prior to that? What needs to be in place before getting started with the estate planning process?
So there's a variety of options that people have. One of the things that I will tell people is that, look, it's your family, it's not my family, right? Nobody's going to care about your family more than you. Like, there's nobody, right? And so if you're doing this for your own peace of mind, that you're doing right by your family, by your children, you're organizing things in the best possible way, and you're getting the best advice that you can do it with, right? So if going online for a free tool or one that costs a couple of $100, if that gives you peace of mind, do it, right? If going to an attorney who can provide you with some advice that you think that attorney is doing a solid job for you, even though it costs more than that, then do that, right? Just do whatever it is that you think is best for your family. The way we handle things, and you can check out, by the way, my website is islamicinheritance.com. So just very easy to remember. I have like an email list, and it's just a lot of, there's a lot of information on Islamic estate planning, and a lot of there are many other types of issues that we talked about today and things that we didn't talk about. And if you are interested in that, I would love for you to keep in touch through that. And there have been people that have been on that for 10, 12 years, and later on they reach out to me. It's a process of, well, when it is that you're ready. When it is that you're ready, that, okay, well, this is something that I need to do and I want to take care of it, then you take care of it. Because it's a pretty significant investment of time and resources if you're going to do it right to do that. So do keep in touch, and do go to islamicinheritance.com. And of course, I have some business cards if you do want to reach out. But yeah, we know our normal process is we give people a worksheet. Demographic information, financial information, names of kids, things like that. And then normally it's like for most people, not everybody, but for most people, you budget about 90 minutes to plan everything out, prepare the documents, confirm everything, and then we prepare a variety of documents, record a deed with the county, and make sure that it's a document that our clients feel comfortable signing, because it's one of the most important things you're going to be doing for your family. Unless you have some peace of mind in doing it, it's just a bunch of pieces of paper with stuff written on it.
Absolutely. Jazakallahukhairan, Brother Ahmed. I want to leave some time for Q&A before Isha, so does anyone have questions?
There's a microphone there. But I think we can all hear each other, right? Well, I think there's a live stream. I don't know if anybody's paying attention to this. Maybe it's good for them.
Good information. My question is for living of trust. Now, is it Islamically if you want to allocate for your girl the same part for your boy, or to give one of your children more than other children? So, is it Islamically, is it lawful?
Okay, so this implicates the issue of the Islamic rules of inheritance, and if there's one rule about the Islamic rule of inheritance, I mean, a lot of people don't necessarily engage with it too much, but if there's one rule about the Islamic rules of inheritance that practically everybody knows, it is that sons tend to get more than daughters. Not tend to, they get more than daughters, right? And that's an issue I'm glad you asked that question. It's something that's actually very important. I once had one of my clients who had this situation with he showed the living trust to his 13-year-old daughter. She wanted to have a meeting with me and just go over that, and why does that need to be the case? And we, after we talked about it, she was like, when I first met you, I thought I didn't like you because you were probably some raging misogynist, but you seem pretty cool. So after, the whole issue is, well, what happens with inheritance, why it is that way? Inheritance is not about who is the breadwinner. It is not about who is closer to Allah. It is not about who is more worthy. It is really after you pass away, then there is a uniform system of inheritance. And it's supposed to be distributed that way. One of the things that, and this is, inheritance is not uniformly based on gender. It's not more for men than women. So for example, a father and mother get the same. But we understand that for boys, and one way I kind of explain this to people is, say for example, you have a 40-year-old man and a 50-year-old woman, and their brother and sister. And the 40-year-old man is very successful, is doing quite well financially, and has a nice home, nice family, all of that stuff. And the 50-year-old woman is destitute, needs a lot of financial support, help. Now, in the United States, I'm going to just ask you a question about American law or California law. In California, is there a cause for the 50-year-old woman to go to court and ask a judge that, hey, judge, I am in need of severe financial help right now. My brother is obligated to support me as my brother. Can you make him support me? No, that's not a thing. Now, in Islam, that's a thing, right? That's definitely a thing, but it's not enforceable here. And so one of the things that we might do is we might make it enforceable within the trust. And I've done this for some people before, where if you're concerned that, first of all, you're not, the males of the family are not going to take care of the females. Because sometimes the way it's described, and sometimes people when they speak against the Islamic rules of inheritance, specifically this thing, they're talking about back in the old days, it was different. Men were honorable and they were good and they were wonderful people, and now they're these man children that are horrible to women and whatever. And it's always been complicated. Men have not always been wonderful throughout all of history. Men have not always been bad. They've been bad and they've been behaved well, and they've behaved not well. They've fulfilled their responsibilities, and they've not fulfilled their responsibilities at all periods of history. One thing that you could do is that if you are concerned about that, is that you could say that in the men's share of inheritance, the daughter is potentially a permissible beneficiary. Remember when I talked about keeping it in trust and keeping the assets in trust? In some cases, we might do it that way, that if we would create essentially our own quasi-judicial system, where if the boy is not taking care of his responsibilities to the women in the family, then the trust would deal with that type of a situation. It gets a bit more complex to do it that way, but if we're talking about, well, in America we can't do that. Well, it's a trust. We can create our own law, right? We're already creating our own law by making sure that the inheritance is done based on the Sharia. It's not a big stretch to say that we can actually create enforcement mechanisms or even contracts saying that before you get your inheritance, you can say, well, if your daughter needs assistance, support, you will always be there for her. There's always going to be a roof over her head, right? This is always something that you are going to honor, right? And so that isn't necessarily a stretch. The other aspect of it is, well, what if I don't like the shares of inheritance? Now, and I want to just change it by giving stuff during lifetime. Now, this actually has to do with your intent. You cannot give gifts, or you can't really do stuff to subvert the Islamic rules of inheritance. A lot of the times, you're not doing that. You might, and this brings up the question of, well, what if I have two children, and one of them is a son who is very successful, and is done very well in school, done very well in life. And then I have a daughter who has Down syndrome, probably isn't going to get a good job, probably isn't going to get married, and is going to need support for the rest of her life. How is it fair that she's going to get half the inheritance of the son? And so inheritance is not something that exists to to fix social problems or to fix family problems that exist at some point in the future. Remember, we're planning for a world where you don't exist, and the circumstances of the people you leave behind, you have absolutely no idea, right? And so you don't necessarily know who is more deserving. The Quran, in the context of parents and children, actually even explicitly says that. You don't know, between the parents and the children, you do not know who is more deserving, right? Because parents usually are richer than kids because parents live longer. That's often what happens, but yet parents get inheritance, right? Why do they get inheritance? That doesn't sound fair to a lot of people, but that's what Allah's judgment is, right? And so similarly, if we want to give more to the daughter, we could during our lifetime. Because we want the daughter to have more of the business, maybe because the daughter has Down syndrome and needs a special needs trust to take care of her needs, right? Maybe we want to, maybe we just want to give gifts. I want to give gifts to my kids and I want the gifts to be equal, or I want the daughter to get more because, she is going to MIT and the tuition is way more expensive than MIT, and my son is going to, San Diego State, and, tuition's way cheaper there, right? And you have reasons for doing what it is that you are doing that are not to subvert the rules of inheritance. And you cannot, there are some other rules with respect to the Islamic rules of inheritance, including like deathbed gifts. Like even if you wanted to give a gift to charity, like a really big one just before you die, you can't really do it. It has to be based on the Islamic rules of inheritance or limited to the wasiyah amount. But you could if you wanted to, and you're not doing it for the purpose of subverting the rules of inheritance. Also gifts during your lifetime, like say for example, you don't like your kids at all, right? And you don't want to give them any inheritance at all, but you also don't want to violate the Islamic rules. Can you just say, I'm giving everything to the masjid, and I'm just going to live under a bridge, because I just hate my kids that much, right? You can't do that either, right? I actually had once a situation years ago where somebody wanted to give all of their money to the masjid, right? They wanted to give it all. And I was like, well, you have kids. You can't do that. That's haram. It's actually haram to give all your money to the masjid, right? You have kids, they have a right to inheritance, and you can't do that. And this guy was like, you know what? I haven't seen my kids in 20 years. They've had kids, my grandkids, I've never met them. They don't talk to me, they don't like me. Why should I give them anything? And then he ended the conversation, thank God in America, we don't have to do Islamic inheritance, right? We're not allowed to cut family ties in Islam. That's one of those things, that's a major shameful haram thing that happens that we need to make sure and maintain family ties with and maintain our bonds with each other. And just because if we feel that this person is more deserving or these people are not deserving at all. Look, inheritance is a right given by Allah, right? It's given by Allah. It is so important that our vanity, our feelings of what we think is right, that goes out the window, right? Because our vanity, our desire to have our dead hand make decisions about the living, that wrecks families, that wrecks people's lives, that wrecks families' futures. If you ever meet brothers who have not spoken to each other in 20 years, right? Oftentimes, the reason for that is because of some inheritance dispute that happened 20 years ago, right? That's often the story. Often people get this wrong, and one of the beautiful things about Islam, one of the beautiful things about the Quran is, and one of the reasons why it's a mercy to humanity, is that inheritance goes to people because Allah ordained it. It's not because you manipulated dad. You did this. You did that. He was on your, he always favored you. And you took advantage of this, that, or the other thing. That happens all the time, right? That happens, and that's a major problem. Here we have this uniform system. Inheritance goes to the people it goes to because Allah ordained it. Even children who are not especially religious. They had a parent who's Muslim, and they might not even pray or fast or anything. They understand this. They understand, look, this was a believing Muslim. He did the believing Muslim thing. She did the believing Muslim thing. The Quran says inheritance is supposed to go this way. What do I have to complain about, right? Who am I going to complain to? Who's my complaint department? It's not my father. It's not my mother. They were Muslims. What do Muslims do? They do what the Quran says. What did the Quran say? Well, it's very clear, right? The fractions are specified in the Quran. You do it that way, you maintain family harmony, inshallah.
Jazakallahukhairan, Brother Ahmed. Any other question? Yes, brother, and then we'll come to you. Yes, please use the mic.
My question is with regards to the guardianship specifically. So for the guardianship, are there any specific rules that we should follow, like, who should we prefer as the guardian for the kids? And ideally, one specific question is that can an 18-year-old be a guardian for your younger sibling?
Okay, so let's go to your last question first, which is, can an 18-year-old be the guardian for a minor child? Yes, of course. An 18-year-old, of course, in California is an adult and can be capable of being a guardian. Of course, an 18-year-old can also be a parent. Yes, the answer to that is yes. Now, who is preferable to be a guardian? This is actually something that you, the other parent, would have to decide as to who is the most qualified, who's the most capable of doing it, and you need to make sure and keep an eye on that, right? This has to be for the best interest of your child. Now, it might be that you're going to name a guardian, then you're going to name a successor guardian. So you might name somebody as a guardian, and then you'll name somebody who could be a guardian if that person is not available to be a guardian. Because remember, we talked about this before, you're planning for a world where you don't exist and the circumstances of the people you leave behind, you really don't know. That person might not be in the same headspace, geographic location. They might not be capable of taking in another child, or a child. And so you'd want to make sure that there are some backups available. You should name as many as possible if you are blessed to know people that you would trust with your children, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be somebody in the United States. We do have a lot of people here, of course, who have ties to foreign countries, who might have brothers and sisters in other countries. It is a little bit tricky to do that because you do want to name people locally as well. And then, of course, there's other things like political risk or things like that can happen with international types of situations. But yeah, you would normally name people. Typically, it'll be somebody in your family, right? And it might not be. It might not be a thing that you're going to do based on rank. So, oh no, this is my older brother, so it should be my older brother first. Don't do rules like that. Another thing is going to be, well, how old are your kids? What is the relationship that your kids have with that person, right? So if you were to pass away, say if a husband and wife were to pass away suddenly in a car accident or something like that, and the kids had to go somewhere, is it going to be someplace alien to them that they're going to be unfamiliar with? Or is it going to be someplace where there's going to be some continuity, right? And so there's a variety of things that you kind of need to think about when you are naming guardians. I think for a lot of people, the choice is quite obvious, right? Given you whatever your family situation is like. And for many people, it's not obvious. Sometimes parents argue over this, right? They'll be like, no, I want the children to be at your parents because I don't like my parents. No, I love your parents. I don't like my parents. So people might argue about these types of things. One of the things that you might do under those circumstances is that, just like in the incapacity issue, we might create a guardianship panel, like another shura. We might create a group of people, and so say, for example, it might be this, each spouse's brothers or sisters might form a shura, and they might say, okay, this is the person that is best suited to act as guardian for the minor kids. Another thing to think about with respect to guardianship as well is to make sure, sometimes this could happen, and people are concerned about it, especially if there's disharmony in the family, is that they want to maintain relationships with both sides of the family. So say, for example, if it goes to the father's brother, right, and then the children go to the father's brother, well, what about the mother's brothers? What about the mother's parents? Is there going to be a relationship with these kids and the mother's side of the family, or is it just going to be on the father's side of the family? And so those are the types of things to kind of think about as well.
Thank you. You had a question, brother? Yes. Yes.
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallahukhairan. I have two questions actually. The first one, so if today I write a letter and I have 2 or 3 witnesses, is that, and without doing a wills and without doing the official process, is that something will be considered in court if I pass away? And then the second question, I hear there's a lot of debate about the wills other than the third. Let's say if I have a daughter and I have a son, do I have the right to divide the wills or my fortune or my inheritance equally to both of them? Because I hear there is hadith of Sallallahu there is no wills for someone who died, or there is la wasiyat al-warid. And also they say I've heard that there is so there is a surah that came first إذا حضر أحدكم الموت كتب عليكم إذا حضر أحدكم الموت فوصي إذا ترك خير الوصية, and then they say this, it's being obligated, it's being it's with another surah, it's for in Baqarah. So it's kind of, there are a lot of debate here. I'm not sure if that's something I can do. If do I have to get their approval first, or it's something I can do?
Jazakallah khair.
So, there's a few places in the Quran that lillahi ma fi samawati ma fil ard, right? Everything in the heavens and the earth and all that it contains belongs to Allah, right? And everything that we have, the true owner is Allah, and what we have is entrusted to us, right? And so we have these things, and the question would be, well, can I earn some money and take that money to Vegas and gamble it on the blackjack table? Can I do that? Of course I can, right? This is America. I can do that if I want. As a Muslim, is it allowable for me to do that? And the answer is, of course, no. The reason that is that it's haram, right? And I'd be violating that trust, right? So I'm using the wealth that I have and I'm violating that. If I decide that I am earning all of this money and I'm putting it in, I have one of those Scrooge McDuck swimming pools, right, full of gold coins, right? And I'm just hoarding all of my money, and I'm not using any of it to give any of it to charity, right? I'm not going to give any of it to zakah, right? Am I allowed to do that? Yeah, of course I can do that, right? I can do whatever I want. If I want to be Scrooge McDuck, I can be Scrooge McDuck, right? But of course that's haram. Inheritance is ordained by Allah in the Quran. It has to be, and so one of those things is that if we decide that we know better, right, how inheritances should be distributed. Can you decide that? I mean, I have Muslims come up to me and say, you know what, I disagree with the Quran on that. Well, come on, dude. I mean, that's, we don't, that's not something that, when you're like a believing Muslim, you need to make sure and follow the rules that we have in the Sharia, and it's agreed upon by all of the schools of thought that and it's not just agreed upon a school of thought, it's literally in the Quran as to how the inheritance shares are supposed to be distributed. So if I were to say, well, I think my daughter should get the same as my son, can I do that? Exactly, yes, of course you can do that. One of my principles when I do estate planning for Muslims, if Muslim comes to me and they say, well, I want to, I want to come to you and I don't want to do, I'm Muslim, but I don't want to do it based on the Islamic rules of inheritance. Are you like, you can totally do that, but you need to go to another lawyer because it's actually haram to help somebody do something haram, right? It's like basically me, it's like, it's like, like going to a Muslim's restaurant and saying, well, can you serve me a beer? It's like, I'll get your beer somewhere else, right? I can't, you need to make sure that what you're doing is you're doing it with excellence. You need to make sure that you are following the rules of inheritance. And it's vital. I mean, it's one of the more, it's an incredibly important thing that when you pass away, that you're doing things in the best way that you can. And that includes following the rules of inheritance. If you want to give something to your daughter during your lifetime, right, as a gift or something, you can do that. If your son wants to give his inheritance to his sister, right, like of his own volition, because inheritance is the right of the person receiving it. It is not your right as a person who's doing their planning and is going to die. It's not your right to decide how assets are supposed to be distributed after you die. You do not have that right as a Muslim, right? That is something that Allah has taken and told you what you're supposed to do, right? But inheritance, Allah says in the Quran, your son gets X amount of inheritance. Can your son take some of that inheritance and say, I want to give it to my sister? Yes, of course. Your son can do that, but you as a parent can't do that, right? I mean, that's the rules. Those are the rules in Islam. So anyway, that's my answer. I hope I adequately answered it.
Jazakallahukhairan. We have people from the masjid. Can you confirm 8:15 Isha? Inshallah? Okay. So one more question, inshallah ta'ala. Then we'll give some people time to make some wudu and get some chai as well from outside. Question? Okay. I have a question then. Yeah. So what about having like a stepson or a stepdaughter? I'm sure you probably run into some situation like that. Yeah. In that case, can you just tell us a little bit about what happens in that case? In terms of Islamic, because Islamically they're not entitled for an inheritance, but at the same time you've raised them and you want to leave something for them behind. So what happens in that case?
So you have the ability to do a wasiyah. So you have so anybody who does not have a right to inheritance. And that's not just a stepson. That could be a wife who's not Muslim, right? That could be a child. We have a number of people who are like Muslim. They came to Islam later in life and they have grown kids that are not Muslim, right? And they could be beneficiaries of the wasiyah. Right? So the wasiyah can be useful for a variety of purposes. People, and then yeah, of course, if you have a relationship with people, I mean, we have people who they have poor relatives in Pakistan who are cousins or something like that, and they want to give some of the wasiyah to them, right? It could be like anybody that you feel an affinity for, anything that is any beneficial purpose. You can use the wasiyah for a wide range of things, not just stepsons, but there's just about anybody who is not entitled to inheritance.
Jazakallah khair. We've talked about estate planning, and mashallah, Brother Ahmed has some business cards here, so feel free to grab some and reach out to him. Also, we have the table there for Amana Mutual Funds if you're looking to look into Sharia compliant investing, and we can help you even dissect your portfolio to look into what you're currently investing in, how we can purify it. And we also have Brother Murad visiting us with Life Dao. It's about life. It's a life insurance, alternative life insurance for Muslims that uses takaful as a means to make it work. Alhamdulillah. So Jazakumullah khair. Great having you. Great. Thank you for having us. And inshallah, it was a beneficial session for you. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.